Hello everyone, I'm Wendell Jones and welcome to this edition of our program Jones & Company. On our program we examine the national issues of the Bahamas. For the last several days, church leaders have been meeting in the Bahamas discussing what is called the Non-Profit Organization Bill. That is what they are calling it. But it's a part of a compendium of bills for the financial services sector of the Bahamas, passed in the House of Assembly last week. And on our program today, we want to discuss this particular bill that was withdrawn in the Senate or delayed in the Senate. And we don't know what is going to become of it in the next several days. On our program today, we are pleased to have one of the leading clergymen in the Bahamas in terms of public commentary, Pastor Cedric Moss from Kingdom Life Church. Pastor Moss, it's good to have you here again.
It's good to be here.
I mentioned that you are one of the leading clerics in the country with respect to commentary because you've led the way in your commentary on various national issues. And I believe that you have the nationalistic zeal, the patriotism to study legislation coming before the Parliament of the Bahamas, and I believe you have an obligation to comment. Isn't that right?
I do. I
Yes.
do.
What do you make of the latest piece of legislation with respect to the non-profit organizations in this country?
Well, there's a lot to say about it, and what I would say is it's filled with difficult and troubling provisions. And what I am grateful for is that at last there seems to be wider consultation among nonprofit organizations, in particular churches. And so I'm encouraged that the concerns are being ventilated. And I do believe that the concerns are with merit, and I do believe they will be heard.
You wrote a letter to the editor of the Bahama Journal recently, and you believe that the bill itself contravenes or infringes the Constitution of the Bahamas.
Well, no, I certainly believe that Section 7.1, I believe it is, that requires all nonprofit organizations to be registered with the government in order to operate. I believe that is contrary to the Constitution, because the Constitution grants us the freedom to associate with whomever we wish to associate. The Constitution also grants us the freedom of religion. And so if a group of individuals want to band together for their own interests to associate concerning some purpose, whether it's, say, the potcakes or whatever, and they contribute some small amount towards that endeavor, to write a law that says, before you can do that, before you can enjoy that right to associate, you must register with us. That seems to me to be going on top of the Constitution with legislation, which we all understand. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Same thing with churches. If a group of individuals decide that they want to band together and start a church and propagate their religion, the Constitution says you can do that without hindrance. To require them to register with you, and not even register, to apply to be approved to do that, seems to me to be going above the Constitution. Now, the other provisions in the bill, I think many of them are certainly constitutional, and I would also say I think some of them are good.
Your objection in the main, though, would be that this piece of legislation makes the church accountable to the government.
Oh, it does do that.
Yes.
It does do that. And the other part of my concern would be that when you consider, and maybe this is a good time to kind of lay some foundation, I believe that we all recognize that the world has changed, and the world is changing as it relates to terrorism and the funding of terrorism. And the concern behind this legislation, this piece of legislation, and others that the government has passed, is that we want organizations to be cognizant of the fact that there can be abuse of the systems within organizations to fund terrorism. And so the impulse of the bill is not a bad one. But when you read what the Financial Action Task Force asks countries to do, you have to conclude that what the government has done is an overreach. It is beyond what they've been asked to do. If I may read what they were asked to do.
What the Financial
Action Task Force asked countries to do.
Countries to do. Okay.
Yeah, this is recommendation 8. And this is what it says. Countries should review the adequacy of laws and regulations that relate to nonprofit organizations which the country has identified as being vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse. Countries should apply focused, proportionate measures in line with the risk-based approach to such nonprofit organizations to protect them from terrorist financing abuse, including A, by terrorist organizations posing as legitimate entities, B, by exploiting legitimate entities as conduits for terrorist financing, including for the purpose of escaping asset freezing measures, and C, by concealing or obscuring the clandestine diversion of funds intended for legitimate purposes to terrorist organizations. This is what countries were asked to do. Identify them. What the government has done is the government has says, all of you, all nonprofit organizations. What the Financial Action Task Force says is, identify the ones that you consider vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse. Then it also asks the countries to apply focused, proportionate measures. So I think the government, in my view, has gone beyond what they've been asked to do on two measures. One, they have taken a shotgun approach to all nonprofit organizations instead of saying, we are going to target these particular ones, and here are our reasons. Come to the churches and say to us, we believe you are vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse, and so we want to regulate you. No church, in my opinion, is. Okay. Then the other part of that, even if you identify as being so, let it be proportionate.
Yes, but Pastor,
let it be proportionate. It's not proportionate.
Have you ever heard any church in the Bahamas? Has there been an inkling of a church in the Bahamas,
not to my knowledge,
involved in the funding of terrorism?
Mr. Jones, I have jokingly said, when you consider what it takes to fund terrorism, and you consider the financial circumstances of our churches, they can't buy bullets, right, much less bombs. Right. So I think it is like what the government has done is kind of like taking a machine gun to kill a mosquito. I mean, you don't do that.
Next thing, do you know, or has there been an inkling of any church in the Bahamas involved in money laundering?
Not to my knowledge, but I would say, based on the definition of what money laundering is, that is certainly possible.
Yeah, fine. Everything is possible. But a church involved in either of those things is really not a church.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. And I don't think that would be the part of the spectrum of nonprofits that they would be concerned about. I think they'd be concerned about non-church entities being involved in those kinds of activities.
Good. And so your recommendation then to the government would be what?
Well, I would say slow down on this bill, take more time to consult, to have an appreciation for the universe of nonprofits in the country. They are diverse and they have peculiarities about them that you need to recognize. And one of the things you will see as you read the legislation, as you look at the reporting requirements, you can see that the government is taking a one-size-fits-all approach to nonprofit organizations. Churches are very different.
But shouldn't the church be excluded from this particular bill that is being pushed by the government?
It can be if the government chooses to address these concerns for the churches in separate legislation, that is a way to do it. But it doesn't have to be in order for the government to sensitize churches to the realities of money laundering and terrorist financing abuse. But they would have to make a lot of changes. My own preference would be that they do have a different regime for churches, and I'll tell you why. One of the things that's happened by this one-size-fits-all approach, this omnibus approach for all NPOs, is the government is not distinguishing the churches from these other groups. And Mr. Jones, the church has been started by the Lord Jesus Christ. The church is different and distinct from these organizations. And I think that it is wise to recognize that, wise to recognize the peculiarities. I'll give you an example. This provision for, I think it's section 24 of the bill, where they're asking, well, not asking, but saying that every 2 years, nonprofit organizations must file with the Registrar of Nonprofit Organizations the names of the 10 top donors plus the amounts that they have given, whether one time or cumulatively. When members give to their churches, that is an act of worship. That is an act of worship through those churches to God. The government should think a million times before they try to insert themselves into worship between an individual and God. Now, there may be good reason for them to say to some charity that takes in a certain amount of money to pay out to any number of endeavors in the community, they may want to say, we want you to tell us these kinds of things. But certainly not when what is given is an act of worship unto God. That is high-handed and, in my view, sacrilegious.
Should the church at all be accountable to the government?
The church is not.
Its finances?
The church is not accountable to the government, and I don't know that what they are putting in.
I know it's not.
Yeah, it is not.
Should it be?
It is not. And
on financial affairs?
It is not, and it should not be.
Okay.
It is not, and it should not be. However, I personally do not have a difficulty with churches being required to submit financial statements to the government to be able to access many of the concessions that government gives to churches and to other. This is what they do in many developed countries.
Then the church is accountable.
No. It's not accountable. You can choose not to do that.
If for you, if it means that you can only get, say, duty-free exemption or some incentive from the government through, or because you are submitting your financial statements to the government, then it means that you are accountable to the government.
Okay, I will concede that those who do that would be.
Yes.
But those who do not won't be. What this legislation seeks to do is make everyone, whether you want to or not, become accountable to the government.
Yes.
My position is what the government should do is put in place a legislative regime to govern charities, nonprofit organizations, churches, etc. And say to them,
then once you agree to that, once you say that, then you are making churches accountable to the government.
There are churches in the United States that are not registered with the government.
But it doesn't matter.
No, I'm saying to you that you can have both worlds. You can say to churches, if you want to access these benefits from the government, we want to know that you are keeping proper. I'll give you an example. Yeah, Mr. Jones.
But
Mr.
you are
Jones,
contradicting what you said earlier
on.
I'm
not. No, I'm
not. Because when people make donations to churches, when they tithe, when they give their money to churches, it is as if they're giving the money directly to God.
Okay.
And if you have to account to Caesar,
let me explain.
And I want you to at the same time talk about the scripture which says, render to things that are Caesar's and render to God the things that are God's.
Let me explain. Whether a church is registered with the government or not registered with the government, the individual donation information should never come before the government. Never. However, in a global view of the finances of a church, which will be financial statements, the balance sheet, the profit and loss statement being provided to the government, you don't see details of giving in that. You don't know what individuals gave. It simply shows you that this church is keeping proper financial records. Mr. Jones,
but churches are not in a business, as you said, profit and loss.
But hear me. Hear me what I'm saying. Right now, there is abuse of the provisions that the government makes available to churches and nonprofit organizations. There's abuse right now. For example, the government allows carpet, for example, air conditioning, a vehicle to be brought in by churches and nonprofit organizations duty-free. I have heard of individuals who have been using those things for their personal benefits. That's wrong.
Yes, but that is an abuse.
That is an abuse. And what I'm saying
that is an abuse.
I'm saying to you, if you put in place the kinds of protocols and regulations that would hold people to a higher standard in whether they're leading a church or some other nonprofit organization, that would be a good thing for all of us. So all I'm saying is this, and I'm not speaking for the whole church, I'm saying from my point of view, from our church's point of view, we would have no problem submitting financial statements to the government. But we have a huge, Mr. Jones, it is something I will not do. I will not provide to any government the details of the giving of anybody. I will not do that. The only way I will do that, if someone gives me a letter and says, go ahead and give this to the government, tell them I gave this amount to the church. I will do that, but I will not do it otherwise.
Pastor Morse, churches are not established to make a profit.
Mr. Jones, churches cannot exist if they don't make a profit.
No. Churches do not exist to make a profit. Churches are supposed to be involved in ministry. And in your ministry, your church leaders should be responsible in how they conduct the finances of the church. But the church is not in a profit and loss situation as a regular business is. You agree with that?
Mr. Jones, I would say this to you. A church minimally has to break even if it's going to survive. Minimally. And that's not ideal. A church should be thinking about how they can prepare for the future. Because sometimes, I'll give you an example, sometimes giving decreases in churches. And if you don't have room to respond to that, you're going to have difficulties.
Churches operate on the edict that the Lord will provide.
And He does provide.
And He does provide.
And He does provide.
Yes.
But that doesn't call us to...
And He takes care of His church.
He does. And we have to be responsible to
recognize... you should be a responsible steward.
Yeah, Mr. Jones, you may for a season be able to spend more than you take in.
No, we're not saying that the church should spend more than it takes in.
You can't do that for any sustained period of time.
No, I'm not saying that the church should spend more than it takes in. I'm not saying that at all. But all I'm saying that you don't do church for profit. It's a non-profit organization.
No individual...
A church is a non-profit organization.
It is non-profit, but what does that mean? Non-profit does not... No. Non-profit does not mean no profit. Non-profit means that no individual profits from that.
Yes.
And that's the difference between a for-profit. This is a for-profit enterprise. Yes. You get the profits at the end of the day. I am employed with a church that is non-profit, so I don't get any profits from that.
Right.
And that's what non-profit means.
And the church doesn't get any profit. The church, the profit of the church is when you win souls.
That's not true, Mr. Jones. That's not
yes,
true.
when you go out and do ministry.
No.
When you're doing ministry.
No, that's not true.
You don't say, well, you know, this year we collected $1 million and we saved $250,000.
No, I'm sure the churches don't report in that fashion.
You are supposed to be about giving and helping the poor and the widows and the orphans.
It is not either or, it is both and. You are to manage your business affairs in a very prudent manner.
Yes.
And you are to be faithful to proclaim the gospel.
Yes.
You do both.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we have agreement there. Let's take a break here on our program, Jones and Company. Our guest is Pastor Cedric Morse today. We'll come right back.
you.